My name is Kyle Cuyers. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Director of Operations here at the Kaufman Interfaith Institute at Grand Valley State University. On behalf of the Kaufman Institute and Grand Valley, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this critical conversation drawing from David Gushee's book, Defending Democracy from Its Christian Enemies. Thank you so much for coming. The Kaufman Institute offers a broad range of programming that advances equity and belonging for persons of all religious, secular, and spiritual identities by fostering human connection, interfaith understanding, and collective transformation on campus and in our wider West Michigan community. In living into this work, and as we seek to heal our nation together, we want to begin our time by pausing to acknowledge the land on which we have come together. We recognize the people of the three fires, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples on whose land we are gathered this afternoon. The three fires people are indigenous to this land, which means that this is their ancestral territory. We recognize that this continent has long been home to many expressions of enduring indigenous spiritualities that over the centuries have been actively suppressed and outlawed. As an interfaith organization, the Kaufman Institute has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the roles that faith communities have played in the history of forced removal, cultural erasure, and genocide of Native peoples. Naming our history of settler colonialism and its impact on indigenous peoples is how we begin to engage in the important work of justice, but there is still much to do. And so we encourage you to visit grandriverbands.com/takeaction to see how you can join the work. As a couple of housekeeping notes, first and foremost, as always, please remember to silence your cell phones. We will have a Q&A following the conversation between Kristin and David. You can send in your questions by scanning the QR code on your program or by using the tried and true comment cards. Simply pass those to the end of your row and one of our team members will be by to collect them. We'll also have some floating around in case you didn't grab one. Following the conclusion of our time here in the auditorium, there will be a lovely reception just on the other side of the doors in our exhibition hall. We encourage you to stick around and enjoy some refreshments and conversation with one another. Schuler Books will be selling copies of David and Kristin's books. If you don't have them already, no shame. And the authors are very graciously offered to do some book signings, so be sure to stop by the tables to see them as well. If I can take just a brief moment for some gratitude, I'd like to thank David Gushee and Kristin Kobus-Dumais for being with us this afternoon and gifting us with your reflections and insights as we navigate an incredibly divisive moment as a country and resist together the dangers of white Christian nationalism. Thank you to Erdman's Publishing and Schuler Books for allowing us to partner with you in hosting this conversation. And lastly, I want to honor and thank all of the invisible labor that make this gathering possible. The incredible Kaufman Interfaith Institute staff, GVSU Conference and Events, Campus Catering, Grand Valley Police Department, and our amazing custodial team. Thank you for all the work you do in helping to prepare this beautiful space for us. And so without further ado, at this time, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this afternoon, the Executive Vice President and Editor-in-Chief at Erdman's Publishing Company, James Ernest. James, I welcome you to the podium.
We at Erdman's Publishing are very grateful for the work of the Kaufman Interfaith Institute, and especially for this collaboration today. We hope that it may be one of many cooperative ventures to come. We share some important commitments. Erdman's Publishing has been publishing books in Grand Rapids since 1911. The roots of our publishing house are in the Dutch Reformed branch of the Christian tradition. Dutch theologians like Abraham Kuyper, who was both a theology professor and a prime minister of the Netherlands, understood that Christians are called by God not only to follow Jesus in their private domestic lives, but to participate fully in the life of the world and to see all the world, including its non-Christian elements, as the theater of God's glory. This meant that Christians were to participate in all areas of society: family, church, education, business, industry, manufacturing, entertainment, and government, and to do so as followers of Jesus. Some Christians who claim Reformed ancestry go further and assert that Christians are meant to capture and dominate all of those spheres, and to do so in ways that disenfranchise and dominate people of other faiths and people of no faith. For believers of that sort, core democratic values can be sloughed off and overridden if adhering to them interferes with the quest for domination. Our publishing house deliberately seeks out and works with authors who believe in sharing the beauty of Christ with the world, not with authors who believe in weaponizing their faith for battle in culture wars. We work with authors who believe that Christian faith requires its adherents in their life in the public sphere to do what the Kaufman Interfaith Institute names as its mission: to advance equity and belonging for persons of all religious, secular, and spiritual identities. Our pursuit of this mission brought us into contact with Professor David Gushee, and the result is the book that he and Professor Kristin Dumais will be discussing with us momentarily. Now I'd like to invite Cecilia Olson, a graduating senior and Kaufman Interfaith Campus intern, to the stage to introduce our two honored guests.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is so wonderful to have you all here today and to be with you. My name is Cecilia Olson, and I'm an intern with the Kaufman Interfaith Institute, and I'm also a graduating senior from Grand Valley this year. I'm very excited. Thank you, thank you. It is an honor to introduce and welcome our wonderful speakers today as a representative of Kaufman and on behalf of Grand Valley. It is also a personal treat for myself as someone who has been influenced by the works of these scholars, and through that influence have been exposed to this important social topic and conversation I've grown to be quite passionate about. This mix of influence and exposure and passion, and our speakers, although they might not know it, have played a role in me being inspired to go to graduate school and pursue a PhD focusing on American stories, experiences, and literature. So, speaking of academics and scholars, our speakers today are none other than Kristin Dumais and David Gushee. Kristin Dumais is a New York Times bestselling author and professor of history and gender studies at Calvin University. She holds a PhD from the University of Notre Dame, and her research focuses on the intersection of gender, religion, and politics. She has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, NBC News, Religion News Service, and Christianity Today, and has been interviewed by NPR, CBS, and the BBC, among other outlets. Her most recent book, which you might be familiar with, is Jesus and John Wayne: How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. David Gushee is the Distinguished University Professor of Christian Ethics at Mercer University in Atlanta, Georgia. He also serves as chair in Christian Social Ethics at Vrije Universiteit and Senior Research Fellow at International Baptist Theological Study Center, both in Amsterdam. His many other books include Righteous Gentiles of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Moral Obligation. Please help me welcome our wonderful speakers to the stage.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming on this beautiful sunny day. And special thanks to the Kaufman Institute, GVSU, and to Erdman's for hosting this event. I always look forward to talking with David, and it's fun to get to do that in front of a crowd. So before we get into the book, David, I wanted to ask you to set the historical stage for us. And by historical stage, I mean this moment of history that we find ourselves in. Because my sense is that people may be coming to this space from a variety of different places, perspectives, level of knowledge, level of alarm even, around the question of the current state of our democracy. So how would you assess the present moment?
Unprecedented moment in our lifetime in the United States, in which the very constitutional framework that we had taken for granted, the operation of our government, the freedoms that we understand to be guaranteed by the Constitution, and the culture that has supported liberal democracy, all of these are threatened. I would say that it's a moment in which American exceptionalism is giving way to a kind of, or may give way, to a kind of a depressing commonality with the histories of a lot of other countries in which democracy was started, operated for a while, and then was backslid. That's actually what the political scientists say. They use the word backsliding, good Christian word there. Where a country that had been committed to the principles of democracy and the practices of democracy backslides into authoritarianism. And we are at risk of that in a way that I don't think we have any precedent for. We've had voices of people who had authoritarian tendencies, but never at this level. So we join the ranks of countries for whom every election becomes not just a decision as to which person or persons will govern within the settled framework of a liberal democracy with separation of powers and traditions that have solidity and firmness and peaceful transitions of power and lack of political violence and all of that. We're now in a situation where every election, even every off-year election, every 2 years, not just the presidential elections, becomes an existential event related to whether there will be outbursts of political violence, whether the results of the election will be accepted, and whether there will be a peaceful transfer of power. And that makes us more like the rest of the world. So if you were against American exceptionalism, well, there you go. We've made it to be like the other nations. So I do think that's the moment that we're in. I think there's a long backstory to how we got to this moment. I know we'll talk about that, but I don't think that is exaggerated because we have the evidence in front of our eyes about what happened in 2020, and a lot of the same people are in the arena 4 years later. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So you'd say your level of alarm is scale of 1 to 10 right now?
Very high. I was, in 2022, I write in my book that I thought the election results of 2022 were pretty encouraging.
Yeah.
Because a lot of election-denying, ultra-Trump type candidates were put up for various major offices in various states, including this one, mm-hmm. and lost, which is hopeful. I mean, it means that, for example, the election administration in the state of Pennsylvania and the state of Georgia, actually, where I live, and the state of Michigan and the state of Arizona, yeah. and so on, is in the hands of people who actually believe in democracy yeah. and will administer the election process fairly. So that drops my level of concern to 9.85.
Great. And I know you and I were talking before we came out here about, we're both kind of at that point on the scale, and the sense of disconnect that we feel with a lot of people, including a lot of people who are otherwise, fairly engaged, but not tracking really closely what is happening at the national level, in terms of organizational networks at the state level, and down to the local level right now. And I think that's one of our goals here today. And in fact, in a lot of the work that David and I are doing right now is to try to bridge that gap and make all of you rest a little less easily as well.
We're here for you. We're here for you.
Welcome.
Oh.
So there's a lot of talk right now in the media around the issue of Christian nationalism, right? That's kind of the favorite term. It's been kind of strange watching that term, which was a fairly common term used by scholars, by historians for decades now, really, kind of have its moment. And now all of a sudden, I'm sure you get the media requests too, journalists, nearly every call I get these days and nearly every day, is this person a Christian nationalist? Is this Christian nationalism? What is Christian nationalism? Now, in your book, you prefer a different term to Christian nationalism. So could you talk a little bit about what you think the problems with the kind of Christian nationalist discourse are, and what you think is a better term to kind of capture what it is that we're seeing?
And it may be that I'm just being a picky scholar in saying I don't like this term as much as this other term that I get to trademark, or whatever. But no, I think it's a little more substantive than that. In ethics, which is Christian ethics, which is my field, we have a long tradition of reflecting on terms like patriotism, nationalism, and internationalism. And in general, cosmopolitanism would be another word in that spectrum. So you might say that there's a spectrum of conviction among people. On the one end, people who think of themselves as citizens of the world, as comfortable in any other city or any other place as they are where they were born. They are cosmopolitan or internationalists, or who people by conviction, even Christian conviction, believe that because all are made in the image of God and every people matters to God, that patriotism, a love of one's country, is actually maybe even a little questionable. It tends to have us prefer our people to other people. So there's a discussion in ethics about patriotism, and then there's a discussion about nationalism, which in that discourse is understood to be a kind of an exaggerated patriotism, in which the country is loved excessively, usually involves inordinate puffing up of pride in one's own country, an inability to be critical of one's own country, and then maybe a diminishing of the value of other countries. We're the best country. They're less important. In fact, maybe we can do whatever we want to them because, okay. So you see, that framework is where I think of the word nationalism. And that doesn't have much to do with the discourse of Christian nationalism in the U.S. right now. That's not what people are talking about. And so my ethics antenna goes up to say, I'm not sure that what is that in Princess Bride? I don't think that word means what you think it means, And so when you actually get into the recent blowing up of the use of that term, I think especially of the Make America Great Again book, Whitehead and Perry, right?
Take America Back.
Take America Back, that's right.
Taking America Back.
Taking America Back for God, that's right. I'm sorry. I said Make America Great Again. Please forgive me. They are, I think, talking about something a little bit different, and that is the conviction on the part of a certain part of the American population that this is a Christian nation, but then, and always has been and always should be and always must be, but then a lot of other stuff gets loaded into that, like to be a Christian nation is to be patriarchal, it's to be white dominated, it's to be historically Christian like Protestant usually, it's to be all of those things, right? And so that phrase now means that population that believes that America was, and should be dominated by white traditionalist men who don't accept gay people and who believe they should dominate the country. Okay. So I also get concerned about when a phrase is used so often that sometimes it doesn't seem that people are even reflecting on the meaning. They're just kind of throwing it out there, right? Okay, so in my book, I propose the formulation of, now I know it's a mouthful, authoritarian reactionary Christianity, ARC. Here's how you can remember it. People who are attempting to bend the arc of history backwards.
Ooh, nice.
You got to be a preacher to come up with stuff like that, you know? So, ARC, they are reactionary, and I don't mean that. I don't mean that like, oh, aren't these awful people? I'm just saying, even descriptively, this is a population that has reacted negatively to pretty much every social change since, and many legal and political developments since about 1960,
Yeah.
maybe 1954.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And the accumulating impact of unwelcome social changes, including the sexual revolution, the gay rights movement, this may be the civil rights movement if they'll admit it, if that's where that's, immigration from non-white countries, the feminist movement, the Supreme Court decision, Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court decision on prayer in schools, stuff like that, is a growing fireball of resentment. A posture of disbelief and disdain, and a belief that the country has lost its way, have left God and God's will behind, and that urgent correction efforts are needed. Reactionary. I think that's a helpful description. I think we all know people like that. My diagnosis is that we have a part of the population, and it's not only in our country, it's a similar phenomenon in some other countries, but in our country it's a bigger part of the population that lives in this reactionary space. Let's call it 25%. And my thinking is that from the 60s through 2016, the strategies of this reactionary population were more mainstream. We're going to evangelize people, we're going to do discipleship, we're going to do missions, we're going to set up K through 12 schools, we're going to do homeschooling, we're going to do Christian schooling, we're going to do parachurch, we're going to make great movies, the great Christian movies that you all love, you know, and we're going to make music, and we're going to lobby, and then the Christian right strategy, we're going to use democratic politics, get Republicans elected, get judges appointed, and we'll be able to take America back.
Yeah.
My feeling is that by 2015, all of those strategies had failed.
Yeah.
They had failed in the eyes of the people who were attempting them, in reversing the cultural changes that they didn't like. And then Donald Trump comes along and says to this population, I'm your guy. And I will be playing by other rules. And I'm not polite about things like democratic niceties and some of the boundaries of the democratic process. And he was sending those signals already in 2015.
Yes.
And it just kind of gradually developed as authoritarianism develops. So that's why I use the term authoritarian. That's a political science term, basically to mean people who favor centralized power and do not care to respect the checks and balances of a democratic system. So what I think has happened is that a significant chunk of these reactionary Christians who've been there for a while have now embraced an authoritarian political strategy. And they are willing, increasingly explicitly willing,
Yes.
like in your most recent post, to contemplate the abandonment of the constitutional order of the United States. And so authoritarianism, reaction, you might say reaction is the jet fuel. Authoritarianism is the strategy when you give up on democracy. These are Christians. They really believe they're doing the right thing from a Christian perspective, and they are ready to rumble. And the significance of Donald Trump, in my view here, is just that he gave permission for an authoritarianism in strategy that had not been acceptable before.
Yes.
But now, like mushrooms on a rainy day in the forest, people are popping up everywhere with various kinds of proposals as to how to undo the liberal democratic order and how to implement authoritarianism in the United States. The other piece, my book does cross-country comparisons like with Hungary, Poland under the Law and Justice Party, Russia under Putin, Brazil under Bolsonaro, and then some older examples. In each case, a reactionary Christian jet fuel is visible in all of those countries, and the idea of a strong man who will come in and give this population what they want more than anything is what helped to make all of those regimes become what they were. And so the link to that term Christian nationalism may still survive in this way. If authoritarian reactionary Christian politics is successful, then the result may be some kind of right-wing Christian nation that is no longer a democratic constitutional republic. And so that's how I would put those terms together at this point. Yeah.
That's really helpful and really clarifying, and gets at exactly the frustration I have with the term Christian nationalism, and why every time a reporter calls, I make them just first listen for about 5 minutes while I distinguish Christian nationalism, the idea that America is founded as a Christian nation, and all of those survey questions, from the correlates, which you listed: anti-LGBTQ, anti-immigration, patriarchal, and so on and so forth, and then from the tactics, right? And I always plead, could we just keep our focus, not that the other isn't relevant, but on democracy, right? On the tactics, the process, because that is what is really unprecedented right now.
Right.
So sure, in a healthy, functioning democracy, everybody gets to bring their values into the political sphere. Christians, conservative white Christians, all of us do, but we agree to work within the democratic process and according to these norms, and we have a healthy respect for pluralism, even though we hope we win. If sometimes we don't, we accept that, we regroup, and then we try again, right? That is what is being abandoned right now, and that is what is so scary. Right,
it's the authoritarianism. If we have a 25% reactionary Christian population for 100 years, that's fine. And if they want to employ every strategy that they employed until Trump came along, that's fine too. Keep building your schools and doing your parachurch organizations and making your movies and making your music and raising your children the way that you want, and doing democratic advocacy for certain kinds of laws and other kinds of laws, and trying to get certain kind of people elected. That's all good. One thing I've been thinking about a little bit more is that it isn't just that this population was doing political stuff like Christian right organizing, Falwell and Robertson. Liberals didn't like it, but still that was within the democratic process, right? It's also the cultural strategies that a lot of us, were raised in, and, all of that is part of a robust society of pluralism and people pursuing their vision of the good. It's when people are prepared to gut the constitutional order that it becomes a three alarm fire. Yeah. And many people, journalists as well as historians, are documenting the plans being drawn up by people who are looking for ways to gut the constitutional order, and they're borrowing ideas and strategies from overseas autocrats like Viktor Orban in Hungary, and even Putin, before he invaded Ukraine, had a certain kind of appeal, maybe still does to some people, right?
In some spaces. So in your book, you've already alluded to the fact that you give some history here, and you cover places like Germany and France, where we see this historical right-wing reactionary movement rise up. If you had to distill this into like one or two lessons from history, given your research into those eras, what would they be? What can we learn from the past for our moment?
So going back to like the France and Germany discussions in the book, it was mentioned earlier that my dissertation was on Christians who rescued Jews during the Holocaust, and so I did a lot of digging in the 1933 to 1945 period in Germany. But in doing that, any good scholar will discover that 1933, when Hitler came to power, doesn't happen just out of nowhere. It's set up by a number of factors. And the main story is economic collapse and social dislocation, and the Weimar Republic is not seen as effective. But there's a deeper backstory. And the deeper backstory in Germany, and it was similar in some ways in France in the 19th and early 20th century, was a population of people who feel that modernity is mainly bad. Here, the targets to be opposed were called materialism, urbanization, modern capitalism, liberalism, secularization, and there was a lot of anti-Semitism because the Jews were blamed for these cultural changes that these reactionaries didn't like. The weakening of the historically dominant Christian faith is part of the story because if society is not going to be organized around the dominant inherited religion, what will it be organized around? And people were anxious about the declining impact and influence of the churches even in the 19th century and early 20th century, not just now. So anyway, the lesson of history is when people feel threatened by modernizing changes, they can panic. When they panic, they can be more easily seduced by demagogues who promise a reversal of the changes that they don't like. And usually the strategy of the demagogue is to blame specific populations for being the problem. So if we could just deal with them, we could make France great again, make Germany great again. The historic target in Europe was the Jewish people, and this ended up culminating in the Holocaust. But democracy itself was seen as part of the problem. Yeah. And so the Vichy regime that collaborated with Hitler and Nazism in World War II and the Nazi regime itself, both of them were authoritarian, anti-democratic regimes that gained support from anxious traditionalist Christian populations who found that what they were promising, like order, tradition, religion, nation, patriarchy, stability, which was all illusory, but it was promised. They liked those promises. Yeah. And that paradigm doesn't go away. And I suggest that there are relevant lessons to us today.
Absolutely. You know, it strikes me as I'm hearing you talk about your first book and that research that you did long ago. I also can go back 20 some years, and my outside field in graduate school was 20th century Germany with a focus on the Holocaust and the German Christian movement. I lived in Germany. I was an exchange student there before that. And so I also have been immersed in German history with a focus on the 1930s and 40s. And, you know, as I was hearing you talk, I thought, you know, this is probably partly why we're both here today and why we're both coming from our different disciplines to speak to this issue, why we're seeing the things that we're seeing, and why we are so concerned on that scale of our level of alarm right now. I mean, you talked about fear. And Marilyn Robinson's words came to mind as you were discussing that fear is not a Christian habit of mind. And I actually thought about dropping that somewhere in Jesus and John Wayne because I really liked it, but I didn't because, in fact, the Christianity that I was describing, it very much was a Christian habit of mind. And Christians were the ones who were really stoking that fear in their communities and beyond. Now, you're a Christian ethicist. How do you grapple with that tension between how you understand Christianity and how you see Christianity being not just wielded, but embraced?
I do think that the role of fear cannot be underestimated. When I talk about my book and just kind of do a lecture on it, I start by trying to talk sympathetically about the fears that motivate the reactionary part of the Christian community. And more, I think a way to say it is fear for the future of their children and grandchildren. When you start talking about people being worried about what will happen to their children and their grandchildren, whether they will turn out the way that parents want them and grandparents want them to turn out, you're talking about the most visceral fear that people have. And of course, this fear is being manipulated and stoked. Yeah. But so yes, I do think that the reactionary Christian movement is deeply motivated by fear, especially fear for their children. But the broader issue is, I'll just say it directly, just as our society is splitting, like tearing, the churches are tearing too. The Christian population is tearing too. And you and I both, I'm sure, would say that the people who hate us the most are our fellow Christians.
Yeah.
On the other side of the tear.
Yeah.
And hate is not too strong a word.
No.
So what I try to tell my students is, I teach seminary students who are preparing for ministry, is that there are various versions of Christianity. There's not one thing called Christianity. And that every time a preacher stands up and gives a sermon or teaches a Sunday school class or writes something, she or he is offering an account, a version of biblical interpretation or of the Christian message. And that I say to my students, you are accountable to do your work well, so that from the first person to the last in that sanctuary, they're getting a healthy, Jesus-faithful version of the Christian story. And you will be held to account for that. James 3. He can quote the Bible. What we see happening, and actually I talked with James Ernest about this in the development process of this book, what is happening is not just a tear in our political fabric and divisions that are really deep, but also variant versions of Christianity in circulation, some of which I don't recognize as having anything to do with Christian faith like I understand it. A faith community and a faith tradition is a living thing. It evolves, it moves, it grows, it changes. And any living thing can be hit by cancer, you might say. And what I think is some cancerous versions of Christianity are in circulation right now. And they bring harm, they threaten death, they toxify wherever they touch. And I never would have thought 40 years ago that I would ever think or say anything like that about some of my fellow Christians and what they preach and what they do, but I just don't know how not to say that now, because I think it's true. And so the tensions across the Christian divide between two groups, both of whom believe of the other, that the version of Christianity that they/we are offering is fundamentally wrong-headed. Those tensions are very acute and very sad. Mm-hmm. Would you say that's right? Does that strike you as accurate?
Absolutely, yeah. We're living the same life in that respect, and we are, as you said, it's the Christians on the other side who are really trying to push this agenda that absolutely see us as their enemies and enemies to their project.
Yeah.
Speaking of enemies, the title of your book, and you already referenced working with James and Erdmans on kind of putting this project together. I'm very curious, as somebody who is no stranger to a provocative subtitle, the conversations that you had, because you all really leaned in on this title. So tell us about your thinking. Did you know right up front this is the title for this book? Did it come along the way? Was there any skittishness on the part of your publisher? Tell us the story of the title.
When I was in the process of being appointed to the Free University of Amsterdam, I had the chance to prepare what they call an oratio, an inaugural address. And so it was while I was developing that in late 2021, early 2022, that this title came to me, and that was the name of the address. And that was where I introduced the cross-comparative European studies for that European faculty. And I never could come up with a different title. I never needed a subtitle. I never could come up with a different title. Every alternative struck me as watering down the main point.
Yeah.
I did get some interesting correspondence recently from somebody from Asia, actually, a Christian from Asia, who said basically, how dare you call any Christians enemies?
Yeah.
By the end of our correspondence, he got it. He understood how I got there. But it is provocative. I would say, what I mainly want to say is, when people explicitly write that they would like to take down the American constitutional order and replace it with a godly Puritan, theocratic, Caesarist republic or quasi-republic or autocratic state, then I consider such a person an enemy to democracy, an enemy to the constitutional order, just factually.
Right.
I don't like to think of any group of people as my own enemies, but the book is about enemies to the democratic system.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And it is provocative. Petitions. I spoke recently someplace, and a petition was gathered to prevent me coming because of the title of the book.
Right.
They hadn't read the book, but that's not uncommon, right?
Story of my life.
Yeah.
Story of my life.
Yeah. No.
So because of democracy's Christian enemies, right, the case can be made, and I think both of us have made this case, that Christians, and we realize not everybody here is Christians, but this is a book, both of us have written books as Christians about the threat that certain Christians are posing to our democracy and our pluralist society, so that Christians have a special obligation to show up and defend democracy in this moment. In concrete ways, what does it look like for, and you can address both categories, for all Americans to step up and defend democracy? And then are there particular things for American Christians to do right now and in the coming months to help defend democracy?
Well, one of the things I try to do in the book is to counteract authoritarian reactionary Christianity with other strands of Christian ethics and theology. And I have chapters on, for example, the democratic traditions within Christianity, and I mentioned the Baptists especially. The covenantal tradition has some significant implications. It has to be understood properly, but I talk about the covenantal tradition, and also the African American democratic Christian traditions, which I sometimes call, or others have called, the abolitionist tradition. So I gave a talk last night. I called it From ARC to DCA, Democratic Covenantal Abolitionism. Friends, come on down. What I want to say is we have resources within our tradition. We don't have to call in secular people to help us figure out how to defend democracy. There are pro-democratic traditions within Christianity. The congregationalist democratic strand, the covenantal strand, and the abolitionist strand are ones that I mentioned, but there are others as well. So we need to make the case again from within the framework of Christian thought for democracy, and why Christians have supported democracy. Why people like C.S. Lewis and Reinhold Niebuhr made arguments for democracy. They're quoted in the book. C.S. Lewis, I quote, he says, I am a Democrat because I believe in the fall.
Yeah. I mean, Calvinists can really lean in here, right? I feel very, we have our own, it's the evil out there, and the evil in all of us that is the strongest argument for
That's why democracy. You need to diffuse power, because if you centralize it, then people are going to abuse their power.
Yeah.
And what happens is the authoritarian temptation is, well, maybe those bad people would centralize it in a bad way, but our guy would do it fine, right? So that's one thing. But I also think we have to clarify that not every voting issue is of the same level of significance. It's kind of like, I keep wrestling for analogies. let's say you're playing whatever game. If you're within the game, you could have different strategies and different, you might think this strategy was better, you might try that, but you're in the game. Authoritarianism ends the game of liberal democracy, and you start a different game. That is a systemic threat which must rank above inflation rates and how you feel about immigration policy or tax things or whatever. And so we have to be able to judge the difference between a systemic threat to the whole system versus specific issues within the system. So vote on the basis of protecting democracy until the threat to democracy is no longer there.
Yeah. Now, with respect to working inside Christian spaces, because that's where the fight is happening to a certain extent, at least one of the places, you're also aware of the fact that power dynamics within Christian spaces mean that doing so can really come at a cost. And you are no stranger to the cost of running afoul of certain power structures and orthodoxies. Could you talk a little bit about maybe your past experience in that respect and what it was like to pay a price?
Do I have to?
No, you don't.
I will. No, I will. I mean, the first death threat I ever got was when
I didn't mean to.
Yeah. So we start there, right? I mean, I remember when I began giving lectures on the Holocaust as a brand new professor, getting neo-Nazi threats, and it has periodically come back. And the atmosphere of intimidation is, I think, worsening. Social media has provided a platform for anonymous and not anonymous people to organize, to intimidate and threaten. It's become, in fact, one of the main markers of a transition from a democratic liberal order to an authoritarian order is when violence and threats of violence become a routine feature of public life.
Yes.
And that has been unleashed in the last few years. There were vague threats of violence earlier in my career, and now the threats of violence, I think, are much more specific on people. I haven't had that myself recently. But when I wrote my book, Changing Our Mind, Calling for LGBT Inclusion in 2014, I was unceremoniously kicked out of the evangelical community, and every opportunity in that world disappeared overnight. Yes. And the personal cost, lost friendships, lost reputation, lost honor. Lost friendships are the hardest.
Yes.
But after a while, you learn to assimilate the cost. It's kind of part of doing what you and I are both called to. Sometimes I wish this wasn't my calling. I've been doing this for about 30 years, and there have been a number of fights along the way, and a number of broken places. And so I feel the weariness of a kind of a weary old warrior sometimes. And I wish it could be over. But actually at Muskegon Community College yesterday, I talked about calling. And I said I've had 3 calls in my life: to follow Jesus, to be a pastor, and to be a scholar. And every day I wake up pursuing those callings. And I've never been released from any of those callings. And so those callings have taken me in some places I didn't expect, including a book on democracy. Yeah. But when you are in the center of what you are called to do and believe that God has called you to that work, then you do it. You just do it.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. And I asked that for a specific reason, in that, I think the challenge that we are posing here to those of you in the room and out of this room who are listening in is that this is a time to act. And that depending on where you're situated, it might come at a cost. But you're not the only ones. Also, it might not, right? You never know. One of my favorite kind of inspirational quotes is from Timothy Snyder's book on tyranny. And one of the points of resistance is do not obey in advance. Do not obey in advance to fight against authoritarianism. And I think that is absolutely critical. That, so often we don't do what we have capacity to do, what we maybe feel called to do, because of some sense that it might not end up well for us, right? Or it might even be dangerous for us. But the truth is, right now, despite our high level of alarm, it's relatively safe. It's actually really safe, all things considered, to be politically engaged, to say what you think is true, to get involved. And yes, there is a chance that it could cost you, but it probably won't, not yet, not right now. And what I can say is that acting right now is going to go over much better for you, for all of us, than a year from now if things don't go well in November and in January, right? And so, to not get too dour at this point and just talk about threats, also really think in terms of opportunities, that you all have a moment now to figure out what it is that you can do. And to try to end on a slightly more upbeat note, before we move over to open Q&A, where we'll probably get really negative again, just comes with the game here, is to think about, I know I have found this, and I know I go back and forth between being weary, but I haven't been in this 30 years. I've been in this particular game less than 10. So I'm still fresh-faced and, maybe naive, but no, I'm actually not very naive. I'm very pessimistic right now, but I just haven't been in it as long. But what I have found is, I think you were getting at this in how you wrap that up. Doing what you feel called to do, right? There is strength there, but also finding and connecting to the other folks who are also doing what they feel called to do in this moment. And so I can say that for all of the kind of hits that I take or attacks that I get, those honestly pale in comparison to the support I receive and the encouragement I draw from seeing other people out there doing what they're doing, sometimes at great risk to themselves and sometimes just putting in the work. I don't know, have you found that too? Yeah. This source of kind of strength and encouragement to face the difficulties?
Absolutely. There's people all over the country, and in fact all over the world, who are pulling in the same direction towards a healthier Christianity and a preservation of the constitutional order, and are working hard at it in various ways, and get out the vote efforts and in what they put on Facebook and the difficult conversations with family and friends that are hard, but they do it anyway. And I can certainly say that I'm getting inundated with requests to come talk about this book because people are looking for hope and resources, and they're not giving up. Yeah. And the community of those who are not giving up is really quite massive, And I do have the hope that, to put it directly, if Donald Trump and the MAGA-type candidates are again defeated in 2024, as they were in 2022 and 2020, it may be that the worst of the threat to the democracy is over, in the short term at least. So I do New Year's resolutions every year, and around December 31st, I wrote in my New Year's resolutions, give everything you have to this fight this year.
Same.
And that's what I'm doing, and I hope that's what you all will do as well. Everybody has a voice, and everybody has an opportunity.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much. I was so absorbed in everything that you were saying that I almost forgot I was going to have to come up here and ask the questions, but I didn't quite forget that. We do have some really good questions that are coming in from our audience. My colleague Will Hearn is sort of putting things on my screen here, and These questions that we have before us, just know that answer them at whatever link you like, but don't try to expand, and you don't have to kill time. There are more good questions,
Right.
okay? So, and these questions, the ones that I see so far, could be addressed by either of you or both of you. So you kind of look at yourselves and decide who's going to talk right now. I'll just ask the questions. One question is, at times it feels like we who consider ourselves thoughtful and rational are playing a different game than the authoritarian nationalists. Essentially, we have rules and they don't.
Yes.
How might we arrive at a level playing field?
Kristin?
The problem is we can't. We can't, because if we change our rules, we lose the game, right? Because our whole point is to stay, within this democratic system, to follow the rules and to not cave, and that is incredibly frustrating. And that's just one layer. I mean, there's also just the propaganda that is spewing from these spaces, including from Christian spaces. And here David and I are, trying to talk about, here's our historical evidence, and here's our footnotes, and here's our careful reasoning and logic, and honestly, that's all I can do at the end of the day, because I do still believe in truth. And I believe that enough people can still see truth. But at the same time, it can be really disheartening because that propaganda is everywhere. And it's from the secular media. It's absolutely from Christian spaces. It's out on Facebook being regurgitated. And so I just keep thinking we have to stand for truth. But those of us who are speaking truth also have to get out into those spaces, right? And then you're going to take the hits, and you're going to keep taking the hits, but just keep speaking truth. Now, in terms of, the breaking the rules when necessary, right? That's a live question right now, I can say, in folks who are trying to save democracy. Right? Do you stack the court? Because look what they did. What are the limits of legislation here? All of these are very real questions. What I can say is when I move in different pro-democracy spaces, participate in these coalitions, I'm still sensing very much a commitment to the rule of law and to our democratic norms and processes. But I'm not sensing that same level of commitment necessarily among the broader public in all spaces. And so I guess that's where I'm seeing things right now. I don't know what you're seeing.
That's a fine answer. Next question.
Okay, well then, and as revenge for David's,
Thank you.
this question I think is directed maybe a little bit more to someone with your kind of pastoral calling and experience. Can you offer some talking points for pastors and leaders in Christian spaces to encourage folks to defend democracy?
The best that I've been able to come up with is offered in the book, available today, actually, outside. At a very reasonable price, I understand.
Well done.
Thank you. Is to remember the history. One of the things we didn't talk about, but Christians had to learn how to be Democrats, little d.
Yeah.
We came from an authoritarian backdrop in some ways, and we came from centuries of Christendom, church-state partnerships, and lack of tolerance for diversity of opinion, heresy hunting and pogroms and the Inquisition, and we had to learn democracy. And absolutism of a monarchical type and of a Christendom type was challenged from within first by Christians. It was challenged by the dissenters like the Baptists and the Quakers and indeed the Calvinists, the Puritans in England. And so I would say teach the tradition. Teach that story. If you are part of one of these traditions, claim the tradition proudly and do a study of early Baptist arguments for democracy, or early Calvinist arguments for democracy, or Quaker arguments, or go into the black Christian tradition in the U.S. and that has been resisting our racialized semi-democracy from the beginning, right? And also, there's lots of good biblical resources. I do say in the book, the Bible does not offer a straightforward case for democracy. It doesn't. That's one reason why people can call on it to do theocratic stuff.
Yeah.
But the Bible does have a lot of resources with democratic potential, including, for example, the covenantal tradition of the Hebrew Bible, the tradition of all of us being made in the image of God, the way Jesus treated people. In other words, how about doing some Bible studies that can reinforce reasons why people should be opposed to authoritarianism and should support democracy. Part of what I think happened here is that we grew lazy in our democracy. We expected that it would always be there, and that people would care enough to play by the rules, and would respect what I call the covenantal framework of constitutional democracy. And when you encounter people who don't have that commitment, then it's a different kind of game. But yes, teach our own best resources, and especially if you're in a purple church with red and blue voters, you might say, that may be the only way to even have a shot at being heard. If you sound like you're a partisan, you may not get through the election with your job, right? But if you're saying, let me just teach the tradition and teach the scripture that I think really speaks to us right now, that is, I think, fulfilling the vocation of pastoral ministry.
Thank you. Just a reminder, and this question reminds me, there's not just one book that's going to be back there. Kristin's book, Jesus and John Wayne, my copy was delivered like the day it was published, and I read it within 2 weeks. Remarkable book. For some reason, this question made me think of that. How do the masculine ideals promoted by white evangelical culture, as discussed in Jesus and John Wayne, compare to the behaviors observed among the participants of the January 6th insurrection?
Yeah, well, I was watching footage on that day, like I'm sure most of you were as well. And then I spent a lot of time looking at images and video from that day. And the Smithsonian actually has a wonderful collection of visual materials and sound recordings from that day that focuses on religion at January 6th at the insurrection. And one of the posters that jumped out at me was this yellow like handmade poster that had a picture of, let's see, it was like of William Wallace / Trump holding the severed head of Karl Marx. So there's a lot going on in it. But if you've read Jesus and John Wayne, you know that the William Wallace imagery is just, it runs through and through modern evangelicalism in terms of this warrior masculinity. And which is to say, right, it's a pretty good fit. Which isn't to say that anybody who is a Christian and likes the movie Braveheart, may as well have been at the Capitol on January 6th, right? That's not how this works. But there are these resonances, these ideals that are just that have been inculcated and just for generations now inside these spaces. God is a warrior God, and men are made in His image. Right, every man has a battle to fight. Now, for some people, they can keep that in the spiritual battle realm, and what we mean is righteousness and the armor of God kind of thing is just that, goodness and righteousness and so on, and truth. For others, it's a very small leap into this kind of actual militancy, and what we see right now is the survey data is making very clear that white evangelicals, right, more than other demographics here, have higher levels of comfort with political violence right now. And that polls have been showing that consistently now for a couple of years since they've been asking that question. So what is the connection between these ideals of warrior masculinity and a readiness to either personally perpetrate violence, or, as is the case for the vast majority, right, they're not out there on January 6th, but they're also not vocally condemning what they saw. They are not drawing that line of violence is absolutely off the table here, right? Instead, I watched my spaces very closely, like white Christian spaces on that day. That's what I was doing. I was watching the screen, and then I was also watching on social media that folks that I know, in networks that I know, what are they saying? What I saw first was denial, right? This is a false flag operation, Antifa. And then that didn't really hold much water. And then I saw a whole lot of silence, just not saying anything. And then bubbling up a little bit, little justification. Not that I condone that, but they kind of have a point, right? And so that's the kind of thing that I look for, which is to say, right, it's not a direct one-to-one connection, but it's also not incidental. This kind of warrior masculinity, fundamentally, it's an understanding of power, right? And then when we look at Christianity, what is a Christian view of power? When we look at the life of Christ, the incarnation, how does power function? And it's not grasping power over, it is the divestment of power. So I think there's a fundamental conflict there.
Yeah. The next two questions I would characterize first as theological and the next as sociological, maybe. A question that has a theological core. Christian nationalists believe in eternal life for the righteous seems to incentivize them to destroy secular institutions because they don't believe anything here on earth actually matters anyway. How can one find a middle ground in order to reason with people who think like that?
I don't think that's exactly how this is working at this point. I think that in general, fundamentalist and conservative evangelical Christians in the US at least, made a transition from an otherworldly, what really matters is the next life posture to a deep interest in what's happening here. Jerry Falwell symbolized that transition in the 70s. From an otherworldly, I'm going to preach salvation, to I'm going to get involved in the political arena to try to get our guys elected who will take America back. And so I think that what the questioner is calling the Christian nationalists care deeply about the direction of the country and what's happening here. In fact, I would go so far as to say that a lively sense of any other dimension of Christianity, the dimension of spirituality, the dimension of eternity, the dimension of mysticism, and is actually weaker than it's ever been. I think that if you actually, I mean, if you were to read sermons from 19th century Victorian England and compare them to sermons today, people thought a lot more about heaven and what happens when you die and eternal questions and personal salvation than we do now. In other words, I think there's a deep this-worldliness in all sides of American religion right now, a loss of transcendence. Or you might say that the transcendent realm is the realm of the state or the realm of the nation. And you might say that we're losing our religion and everything is politics. And when you lose your religion and everything is politics, then politics becomes your religion. Yeah. And so I actually think back to the pastor question, when I was pastoring, I tried to have a balanced portfolio of messages that went across the entire spectrum of the things that the Bible speaks about. And that does include eternal questions and what does happen when you die, and how do we care for the sick, and how do we form character in other words, there's so many different dimensions, and I think we need to remember all of those dimensions.
How have the changes in the demographics of the U.S. population contributed to the rise of reactionary authoritarianism?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, the social scientist Robert Jones has written the book, The End of White Christian America, and that kind of describes this demographic shift that we're seeing, and that certainly fueled this reactionary impulse. Really during the Obama years, you could see that take hold, combined with a couple of other things that happened at that time. The Obergefell decision and growing concerns among conservative Protestants that in light of that and in light of other cultural developments that they had lost the culture. Yep. So they had lost the culture, they no longer had the numbers or were not going to have those numbers for long. And escalating concerns about their own understanding of religious liberty, right? Which for them is always a more expansive interpretation when applied to themselves than when applied to others. And so those things coming together, right, really fueled this reactionary impulse. And it's no mistake that we see, Trump kind of coming out of that. So. Very important, this demographic change. But what I would also say, just to remember that, and when you look at survey data, you can see higher levels of comfort with racism and anti-immigrant impulses, very high, particularly among white evangelicals. Right, which is there's a disconnect there if you know the scriptures in terms of welcoming the stranger and so on. But what I would say is here too we can see that the anti-immigrant discourse often obscures the reality that many of the immigrants who are coming to our country legally, illegally, refugees, right? All of the above. Many are Christians, right? But what's interesting is that kind of Christian connection doesn't really surface within this movement, right? They're seen as outsiders. And so this is Christian nationalism, even though that term has weaknesses. This is where we get to the white Christian nationalism. One of the reasons, there are many reasons that white is actually quite important there. Mm-hmm. So yes, the demographic change is real, but then also the way in which that is being employed to fuel this reactionary movement is also very real.
I would say it's demographic change, the decline of the dominance of the white population, even just numerically, right? But it's also shifting power so that in many, many spaces, the people who are in charge at the front of the room are not white. Yes. So it's both numbers and power. Yeah. And I think the election of Barack Obama symbolized that. Yes. In a way that absolutely panicked a significant part of the population. So you might say Obama plus Obergefell, the two O's there, are really important clues to what happened after.
Yes, absolutely.
Right.
And you can see, right, if you look at the history, if you look at the response in real time among white evangelicals, people like James Dobson, right? They mobilized, knew exactly what they were going to do, and Trump was doing that in the secular space, and there are a lot of white evangelicals who were mobilizing around that set of issues. For Trump, it was the Obama, and white evangelicals, both and.
Yeah.
We are nearing the end of our time. I'm going to ask one more question. And with apologies to those who had other good questions that we just can't get to, I'm choosing this one because I think it gives our speakers an opportunity, if they want to take it, for a kind of concluding exhortation, maybe, which maybe we would want to hear. The question is, Authoritarian reactionary Christianity is ready to rumble, while much progressive Christianity is ready to form a study group.
Yes.
How can we vigorously engage and resist such a highly energized movement now?
Wow, I got to post, tweet, whatever, all that. That's good.
Yeah, who asked that one?
Yeah.
We need
Copyright,
yeah.
Do you wanna go first on that?
Oh, okay. I mean, it's so true, so true. And I mean, that you talk progressive Christianity, we can talk about the state of the left, if you will, progressive organizations. We could talk globally too, in terms of, in the book you talk about this global rise of reactionary authoritarian Christianity, but the networks, the money, the organization, the power on all levels, right? They are outplaying not just the left or the cosmopolitans, but the moderates, right? And so it's very much out of kilter here. If I had a really great answer to how to counter that, I'd be talking to folks who could put it into action right now. It is bewildering to me. And I could go on, and I won't right now, into why we're seeing this. But I mean, that's why we're here today. Right. That's why we are running ourselves ragged to try to put the situation in front of as many people as we can, as clearly as we can, so that people who know how to organize, people who have the capacity, people who can come together in their communities locally and connect to national movements, get out the vote, all of these things have to happen. But what we don't have are those networks. We don't have the money, and we definitely need more energy.
Yeah. In many, you might call them revolutionary settings, it's a minority of highly mobilized, well-funded militants who win the day. Because people are not paying attention in time or with sufficient vigor. Certainly, I would say every single person in this room and every single person who will ever see this video needs to vote, and needs to tell 10 of their friends to vote and say, I will take you to the polls if you need help, and needs to articulate at every opportunity what is at stake in relation to democracy, and needs to bug the pastor about addressing these issues if you're not a pastor, and needs to go on social media and make a pest of yourself for another 6 months or 9 months or whatever it is. In other words, but yes, there is, I would say, I mean, there are various more progressive activist and labor and other kinds of groups that do have some money and are pretty well organized and will do all kinds of things, but not to underestimate the energy on the other side. It's very, very strong. I think there's a group that has a sniff, a scent of a revolutionary change in the democratic order in America, and they think they might have a chance to actually win, like right now. There's they smell blood. You quoted somebody in your Substack this week who said the American government right now is like a house of cards ready to fall?
Yeah.
And they're ready to help that house of cards fall.
Yeah.
I would say that the dysfunctionality of the way we have been doing democratic self-government for a while has helped to prepare us for this moment. The weakness of our legislators, the gridlock, the use of the filibuster, the gerrymandering, all that stuff. We have, before the autocrats came along, we were already hurting our own democracy. Yeah. So if we can get to the other side of this crisis, we need some democratic reforms.
And Michigan, I mean, kudos to us, right? We're a state that has done some really good work along those lines, and to those ordinary citizens who organized, wrote the petitions, sent out the petitions to to push back against the gerrymandering. That is absolutely essential. This is the structure upon which this reactionary movement thrives. The out of kilter, right, congressional, non-competitive congressional districts that play to the extremes and not, strengthening the moderates who have to appeal across both parties. There are so many structural levels that we can work at. That's kind of the long game right now, but we should be doing that, looking ahead and doing everything we can to mobilize for the next few months.
Thank you both very much for all of your words, and we're grateful to you for your thinking and for your speaking here today.
Thank you.